All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&D Deep Dive, the show we dive deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are going to be continuing along that monk homebrew path by looking at a few other subclasses to kind of give us ideas of different ways that the monk has already had its defining features modified. And we're going to talk about a few examples of monks from previous editions of D&D, from other games, that don't currently exist in 5th edition, to kind of get your wheels turning on, oh, I could do something like that. So, quick refresher on the monk itself and 5th edition class design. Every class in 5th edition is designed to play very, very differently, right from the beginning. In order to do that, every class has these things that we call defining features. Defining features either something unique to the class or maybe not unique to it, but they get it earlier or can use it in a different way, and a defining feature has to show up within the first 2 levels. That being said, defining features of the monk, as we mentioned before, it has 4 features that show up in the first 2 levels, and all of them can work as a defining feature. You have unarmored defense, which is not exclusive to the monk. Barbarians get it as well, but barbarians have a different version of it, so we can call it a defining feature. We have martial arts, which is definitely a defining feature. We have ki, which is definitely a defining feature, and then unarmored movement, again, is not 100% exclusive to the monk, but the monk can use it differently than the other class that gets unarmored movement, which is the barbarian, because of the other aspects of the class itself, like the ability to eventually run on walls and things like that. And at least one of the subclasses we've already talked about, the Shadow Monk, actually improves that unarmored movement significantly more by giving more utility to it. So, that being said, let's look at a couple other subclasses to really kind of get an idea of the different ways that you can modify these things so that you can get some very, very different results. The first one I want to talk about, mostly because I'm looking at this at D&D Beyond, and it's the first subclass that shows up, which I'm not 100% certain what? Oh, I guess it is alphabetical because it's way of the. I was sitting here because I'm like, well, Ascendant Dragon, A comes before M, but whatever. Anyway, the first subclass that shows up is Way of Mercy. Way of Mercy is one of the newest subclasses. It shows up in Tasha's Culture of Everything. It is one of my favorites because a Mercy monk plays so differently than any other monk. And it really is built into the Hand of Healing, Hand of Harm. And this is something that's extremely common with monk subclasses in general, is your first 3rd level ability is going to modify a defining feature in some way. The way that Way of Mercy does this is Hand of Healing and Hand of Harm. Basically, it changes what you can do with your flurry of blows and martial arts in general. With Hand of Healing, you can replace a flurry of blows attack with this Hands of Healing, which basically allows you to replace a flurry of blows attack with the ability to heal someone, give someone hit points. You can also use it as an action in and of itself if you're not going to be attacking that turn, but you still want to heal someone. Whereas Hand of Harm is effectively a Paladin Smite. Basically, when you hit a creature with an unarmed strike, you can burn a key point and add some additional damage to the attack. The additional damage is a martial arts die plus your wisdom modifier. So on crits, you get to add double the martial arts die. So it works very, very similarly to a Paladin Smite. The big difference being you can only use it once per turn. And then as you level up, they simply just keep improving the things that happened at 3rd level. Physician's Touch increases the things that you can do with Hand of Healing. You can remove diseases or conditions. And it also means hand of harm when you use it. The creature you use it on gets the poison condition until the end of your next turn, which effectively means they have disadvantage on everything they do until the end of your next turn. That's a really, really useful thing, especially since there's no save for it. It just happens. If you hit them with Hand of Harm, it happens. And then it just keeps going up with other ways to modify and make them more useful. If you are building a monk subclass, the Way of Mercy is a really, really good example of the fact that you don't need to reinvent the wheel for a monk subclass. They literally just give you 2 new things you can do. In the entire class, there's only 2 new options. It's not like, oh, you can do this and this and this and this and this and this. No, it's Hand of Healing, Hand of Harm. That's it. And then every additional upgrade to this is a subclass that you get for monks. It's 6th, 11th, and 17th level is when you get subclass abilities. Every time you hit one of those milestones, they just make it that much more useful. So this is an extremely effective way of really you only need to find one thing, or maybe 2 things, to use an example. You really only need to find 1 or 2 things to really modify that are based on a defining feature. And then as the class levels up, you can just make those a little bit more powerful. And it works perfectly. Again, the Way of Mercy monk is really, really interesting, is really, really cool. So yeah, that is the Way of Mercy. And again, the reason we're looking at this is effectively to template what these subclasses are doing so that you can create your own homebrew, or you can kind of look at a homebrew from, okay, well, this looks like it's following this kind of template of, the Way of Mercy. Introduce something and just make it better and better and better. And so you can make these comparisons of, okay, well, if we compare this to this subclass, it's pretty even as far as balance is concerned, or this one is significantly less useful than the stuff that show up here, so maybe we need to buff this, or this one is significantly more useful than anything you get in Hand of Healing, so maybe we need to nerf it a little bit so that it's not too overpowered. So while yes, I'm talking about existing things. Again, the point of this is to give you guys examples, so either you can create your own home brews that are going to fit and feel good in D&D 5th edition, or you can look at home brews that other people have created and go, oh, I now know if this is balanced or not. I'm not going to have to play 6 or 7 sessions with this to realize that, oh, this isn't balanced and it's making the game not fun. So Way of Mercy. I'm not going to go through every single subclass. I'm just going to touch on a few of them that I think make the biggest changes that make it the most interesting. If we go to something like Way of the Kensei, Way of the Kensei is a very, very different flavor of monk because, as we've talked about before, monks are, they have access to that monk weapons from martial arts, but most of the attacks they make are going to be unarmed strikes because whether they make an unarmed strike or weapon attack as their action, their bonus action always has to be, if they're making an attack, always has to be either 1 or 2 unarmed strike. The Way to Kensei changes that. First of all, your Kensei weapons significantly expand what you can use as a monk weapon, which changes a bunch of different things. Again, a lot of abilities require you to use either an unarmed strike or a monk weapon as part of your attack action in order to do them. And when monk weapon is no longer just simple weapons without the heavier 2-handed property and short swords, it changes things significantly. So Path of the Kensei, which you get at the 3rd level, lets you choose literally any 2 weapons that you want, including ranged weapons, which isn't a thing that monks get to use their get to use their monk weapons on. So this actually can turn into a ranged monk. So that's one big thing. And then you have things like agile parry, where if you're holding a Kensei weapon and you make an unarmed strike, you get a +2 bonus to your AC until the start of your next turn. And you can use your bonus action using Kensei shot to basically do extra damage with ranged attacks. So it makes a significant change to how you play the class, because this effectively turns you into a weapons based monk. And then as you level up, it does a similar thing to what the Way of Mercy does, where it just makes this even better. One with a blade gives you effectively another kind of version of Smite with Death Strike. It's not quite as nice as Hand of Harm, but that. And then your Kensei weapons automatically count as magic, which is very, very useful for overcoming resistances and things like that. You get sharpen the blade. You can use a bonus action to basically turn your Kensei weapons into plus magic weapons. So you can get up to a +3 magic weapon at 11th level by simply using a bonus action, and that lasts for a minute. So that lasts all of combat. So again, just improving what you can do with your weapons. And then unerring accuracy just gives you the ability to hit more often. So the Path of Kensei is actually even more simplistic in how it changes the monk than even the Way of Mercy, which the Way of Mercy only added 2 things. Path of Kensei really only adds 1 thing, which is you have more weapons that you can use, and it gives you more options on how to use those weapons and what kind of weapons you can use as you level it up. So even something as simple as changing the weapon that the class uses can be a massive, massive difference. And when you start looking at the things like the Tasha damage feats that kind of modify what you can do when you do certain types of damage, that can really, really change things. Because now you're not just limited to those simple weapons. You can literally use any damage type. You can use reach weapons, all these other things, ranged weapons, and do some really, really interesting, fun things. Finally, I want to talk about one subclass that doesn't work very well, just to kind of explain how to kind of spot one that's not going to be quite as useful. I'm not saying this is a bad subclass in any way. It just doesn't work quite as well as some other subclasses. And that is the Way of the Sun Soul, which I don't think I've actually done a D&D deep dive on. I'll have to look over my D&D. I'm almost like 200 episodes in and now, so I forget the things I do sometimes. But I'm relatively certain I haven't done Way of the Sun Soul, because Way of the Sun Soul is something that is only shown up, I believe, just in the Sword Coast Adventures guide, and I haven't made my way entirely through that book, especially since a lot of the times, a lot of the classes that showed up in there showed up in other supplements later on. Tasha's did that a lot. So anyway, so the Way of the Sun Soul, again, they do a modification. This one is a modification of the martial arts defining feature, and it's basically it gives you a ranged version of martial arts that you can use. You have sun bolts that you can attack. The big difference between martial arts and the sun bolts is, with martial arts, if you make an attack with a monk weapon or an unarmed strike, as a bonus action, you can make an unarmed strike. With Radiant Sunbolt, you cannot make a single Radiant Sunbolt attack as a bonus action for free. You can use a key point to basically Flurry of Blows your Radiant Sunbolts. But sorry, I'm reading over the abilities. I'm trying to remember if you can use Radiant Sunbolt as part of the unarmed strikes with a bonus action. It doesn't look like it, and it would require you to be within melee range anyway. So that's a limiting factor. And if you're using this as a way to make kind of a ranged monk, it doesn't work very well because now you have to sacrifice your bonus action in order to use your Radiant Sunbolt. You no longer get your free bonus action at attack. There's also the fact that you can't use Stunning Strike with Radiant Sunbolts, which is, as I've mentioned before, Stunning Strike is a massive part of being a monk. It's not a defining feature because you don't get it until 5th level, but it is a definitive feature. It is something that is exclusive to monks, and it was done that way on purpose. The stun condition is something that only monks are supposed to be able to do, with a few very rare exceptions, because it's one of the things that makes the monk unique. And again, that was done by design. They actually intended to make stunning something that's unique to monks. So one of the reasons why there are so few creatures that have resistance or immunity to the stun condition, because that would make monks not be able to do what they're supposed to do against those creatures. So when you're looking at something that modifies something like martial arts, like Radiant Sunbolt does, you have to look at everything in the class. Radiant Sunbolt can't stun. Radiant Sunbolt can't do the free extra to attack. You have to spend key points to get your extra to attacks. But it does mean that you can take advantage of other bonus actions that you might not use nearly as often. Step of the Wind, you might turn this into a really, really hypermobile when you do that, or Patient Defense, the things like that. The monk is very reliant on its bonus actions, so not being able to use it for an attack means you are able to use it for other things, but I believe almost all those other things require key points, so they become limiting very, very quickly. As you go to higher levels, the Sun Soul Monk just starts giving you additional things. Sixth level, you basically get the ability to cast Burning Hands. 11th level, you kind of get a version of Fireball that you can do for free, and it doesn't do a ton of damage. But you can buff it up with key points to make it effectively as damaging as a Fireball. And then 17th level, they give you the ability to basically glow and use your reaction to do a little bit of damage. So when you're looking at the Sun Soul Monk and kind of templating it out, what they do is they introduce a new thing of, we're going to change how this class works as far as the distance required for it to be in combat. This is a ranged version of the monk. And then as they go, we're just going to give you more ranged choices that you can make for various key expenditures. Do I think this is a fantastic subclass? No. Again, the fact that you can't Stunning Strike with Radiant Sunbolt does make this a very limited class. The fact that you don't get a free extra attack with Radiant Sunbolt does make it a little bit less useful. So those are all things that if you are homebrewing, you want to look at. And go, okay, well, how is this going to interact with the rest of the base class? How is this going to interact with how most people play the class? How is this going to give me more choices instead of less? And again, I've mentioned this over and over and over again. The monk is not a damage-dealing class. The Way of the Sun Soul looks like it's trying to turn it into a damage-dealing class, a ranged damage-dealing class, because nothing you get here gives you any sort of control. It is pure damage, and that's one of the big reasons why this doesn't work. If you were to add some control aspects to it, this would probably be a super fun subclass to play. And that is one of the most useful things when you're homebrewing a monk class, is you don't need to add a lot of power to the monk. The monk is not designed to do a ton of power. The martial arts die already, if you use the martial arts die for any sort of damage type things that you do, it already scales with the monk, so you really don't need to make a bunch of adjustments. What you do need to look at is, well, what kind of control aspects can I add to this? Can I add forced movement to it? Can I add things that mess with the action economy in some way? Can I add conditions to it? Things like the grappled condition, where they no longer, reducing their movement speed, or the poison condition, to the things like that. Or can I come up with a new condition that's going to be exclusive to this particular subclass that does something completely different? Maybe, maybe you could go the route of like the Wraith, where it actually drains a particular aspect of them. Like maybe your attacks actually lower their maximum movement speed. That's something that hasn't been done in D&D, is something that actually removes chunks of your maximum movement speed. That would be an incredibly interesting idea. It would require a fair amount of balancing, because being able to remove movement speed from characters can massively break the game if it's not done right. But it's definitely something that's different. So yeah, if you're looking at something like Way of This Is a Sun Soul, and you're going, well, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel good. There's too many sacrifices to it without enough benefits. Don't think about, well, a benefit I could add is just making it do more damage. Monks don't work well as damage dealing classes, and you have to ignore a lot of the kit in order to turn it into a damage dealing class. But if you start looking at, well, what control aspects could I, put in this? Can I start handing out advantage with some of my attacks? Can I hand out disadvantage? Can I give extra attacks to allies? Things like that. Then you can start having a lot of fun with monks as subclasses. And feel free to think outside the box. Again, 5th edition has been around for like 5 or 6 years at this point. And just the officially released materials, there's a lot there. So if you want to make something that does feel truly unique, you do need to think outside the box. And generally, it does mean you're going to have to do some playtesting. Even someone like me, where I have an extensive knowledge of this stuff, there are certain things where I'm like, no, and I say this in D&D deep dives every so often, I can't really judge this based on just the wording. I have to see it used in the game itself to see if it's going to be broken or not. Playtesting is the thing that's essential. So yeah, it's going to take a little bit of work, but starting by looking at what's already there and then building off of it tends to make that a little bit easier. So, yeah, like I said, there's a bunch of different subclasses that already exist in 5th edition. And I'm not going to go through every single one of them. I do D&D deep dives on, I think, almost every single one of them. Like I said, I think Long Death and Sun Soul are the only ones that I haven't done before, and I will probably get to those eventually. And then any new ones that come out, obviously, I'm going to do. But what about what doesn't exist in 5th edition that might have existed in earlier editions, or exists in other games, or just other inspirations of what you would think a monk is? Well, I am glad you asked. If we go back to the early version of the monk, the first version of the monk showed up in D&D First Edition, and it was massively broken. Mostly because in D&D First Edition, in order to play a monk, if I remember correctly, and again, this is going off of stuff that I kind of read last night, and then stuff that I read months and years ago. But if I remember correctly, the monk in First Edition to the D&D required you to have something like a 13 in, at least a 13 in strength, wisdom, dexterity, and one other thing. It required either 3 or 4 stats relatively high. And a couple of those weren't 13; they were base 15. And that had to be at level 1 when you rolled your character. And First Edition D&D didn't use point buy. Point buy wasn't really a thing until you started getting into Second Edition, and then definitely Third Edition it became an official thing. So this was all roll 4d6, drop the lowest, or sometimes it was just roll 3d6 and that's your stat. So being able to roll high enough to get a monk was really, really hard. You generally would not have more than one monk in every 4 or 5 parties that you did. And another thing about first edition is one of the ways that you did it is you roll your stats in order, so you couldn't switch them around to make it fit for the monk, so it was even harder to get it. But monks had really weird hit tables where they, at low levels, they wouldn't do tons of damage, but when they got to high levels, they would just do crazy amounts of damage, and they could stun and all these other things that made them really, really broken. There's really only this tiny sweet spot where monks kind of fit with the rest of the game. We move up to second edition, and monks actually get their own class that is significantly easier to get, and they get a couple kits to in second edition. You had your base classes, and then you had the things called kits. Kits would modify and basically remove certain abilities from the base class and replace them with other abilities. A good example is the Shadow Dancer kit for the Rogue. The Shadow Dancer kit changed their sneak attack to make it do a little less damage, but it added the ability to shadow step and a couple other kind of interesting things that eventually turned into the 5th edition Way of the Shadow Monk. So it's not even a rogue subclass anymore. They transferred it to the monk because it just fit better there. Monks didn't get really a ton of kits in second edition because they were introduced, I want to say, in the Oriental Adventures supplement, and that was nearer to the end. They weren't a base class or anything like that. When we get to third edition, again, I don't think monks were a quote-unquote base class. They didn't show up in the PHB. Correct me if I'm wrong in the third edition. But they did eventually become a base class with one of the supplements. And third edition was based on the big thing for customizing your class was feats, and then prestige classes. And prestige classes for the monk, actually, most of them have already shown up in third edition. You had Monk of the Long Death. Wonder where that is. The Sun Soul Monk. Those were the two kind of big monk flavors. And if you play Baldur's Gate, Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, the enhanced editions of both of those games, the monk does show up there, and you can see there are some monk kits in there. Those are actually based on third edition and 3.5 edition prestige classes. They didn't actually exist in second edition, which is the rule set that Baldur's Gate uses. But if you're looking at some of the other monk-based prestige classes. Prestige classes got crazy in third edition, especially in 3.5, where there was just tons of them. But they did have a few prestige classes that fit well with the monk. Things like, and a lot of them, just looking at the name doesn't tell me a lot, and I don't have these supplements, so I can't tell you what they do. But things like the Shintao monk, the Shao disciple, the tattooed monk, Fist of Hexor, Fist of Raziel, Fist of Zokin, things like that Sacred Fist. I can't really tell you a lot about how they play, other than looking at other things that existed in there. Things like the Sacred Fist, the Reaping Mauler, Panther Shen, Mantis Shen. These are all things that basically kind of changed how your attacks worked and allowed you to do different things, like adding grapples in or being able to change damage types and the things like that. If we look at how those exist in 5th edition, changing damage types and stuff like that, that is kind of in the 4 elements monk. I think that's what that was trying to emulate, is these previous versions of monks that could, punch with fire fists and things like that, which exists in kind of Asian folklore of monks, their ability to kind of control the elements, which the elements, when you're talking about like Chinese folklore, the elements were fire, water, wind, wood, and metal. Where they used a 5-element system versus the kind of standard 4-element system that you see in most like JRPGs and things like that, where it's water, wind, earth, fire. It's earth, wind, and fire plus someone that's a blowhard. So anyway, so when you look at the things like that, that could be something that we could implement into fifth edition. Specifically, again, I'm not a huge fan of the Four Elements Monk because it doesn't work very well. It doesn't lean into any of the defining features well, other than, hey, look, you can waste key points on doing other things. But if you were to turn an Elemental Monk, especially if you went Elemental Monk and used the 5 kind of Chinese elements instead of, wind, water, earth, fire, you do fire, water, wind, fire, water, wind, wood would replace earth, and then metal would be something completely different. That might be really fun, and that would be very, very different than anything else in the game, especially if each different element would be associated with a different kind of control. Something like water might deal with slowing and modifying movement, whether it's slowing an enemy, speeding up an ally, or slowing an enemy or creating difficult terrain. Wind might be more about increasing your own speed, increasing your allies. Fire might have something to do with a burning aspect where you would hit them and it would leave them with some sort of effect that affects them for a specific amount of time. Wood could be about life and things like that. Metal might be more about just specific damage types, cutting, piercing, things like that, actually creating weapons. That could be something that would be really, really interesting. Another thing, and this actually shows up in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I really would love to see it in a much less complicated version that actually works. I'd love to see this show up in 5th edition, is the idea of stances. I am a martial artist. I practice martial arts for over 20 years. Especially if you start looking at Kung Fu. Kung Fu is built around stances and I can't think of the word right now. Just a lot of working on your body and building it up to a certain things. One of the most famous stances that shows up in most martial arts is called horse stance. Horse stance is you put your feet double shoulder width apart, you bend your legs, you get kind of into, in Taekwondo it's called sitting stance, and you put your fists on your hips, and it is a great stance for making you hate your legs for on the next day. Because what it is, because you're basically sitting without something to sit on, you put a lot of strain on your quadriceps and your calves. So your thigh muscles and your calf muscles get a huge workout. And horse stance or sitting stance is used to condition. That's the word I was looking for. It's used to condition your legs, to give you more strength in your legs so that you can have more powerful kicks, so you can have more controlled kicks. The better you can control your legs, the more you can do interesting things. When you look at Kung Fu, there are so many different stances that they do. Monkey stance is one of my favorites because it's another one that's really, really weird. You actually stand on one foot, effectively standing on the ball of your foot, which is really, really rough on your calves specifically because you're balancing your entire weight on your calves effectively. And monkey stance is meant to make you a little bit more unpredictable and let you do some kind of weird things. There's so many different stances in Kung Fu, especially when you start looking at the animal styles of Kung Fu and things like that. And each one is designed to emphasize a different thing. You make different attacks from each different stance. It's a really, really interesting thing. I would love to see a subclass that is built around the idea of changing stances would change how you attack. And the way they do it in Pathfinder is when you go into one of these stances, your unarmed strike works differently. They will change the damage die. They will change the damage type. Sometimes they will allow you to do different things, like you can grapple as part of it using different things. I would love to see a 5th edition monk that is built on stances. Now, the way that it works in Pathfinder is needlessly complicated. It requires taking a bunch of different feats in order to make it work. And it actually removes a lot of your choice because of how difficult it is to get in and out of stances using their 3 action system, as opposed to the 3. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you have 3 actions. And the actions are all the same, and you can use those to do things like move action costs 1 action. Attacking costs an action. So theoretically, you can make 3 attacks on your turn if you decide not to move, but they add in this additional, all these additional floating modifiers to confuse the hell out of everything, where all of your attacks after your first attack on a turn have a significant penalty of like -8 or -10 to the attack. Like it means that even if you decide to make a second or third attack, until you're a relatively high level, you're not going to hit any of them. So they're just a complete waste of time. So that system is needlessly complicated and doesn't work. And this is from people that play Pathfinder 2nd Edition have agreed with me. Yeah, it doesn't really work. It's a cool idea, but it just doesn't work. So I would love to see that show up in 5th Edition, using 5th Edition mechanics and the idea of simplicity is best. Don't add any complexity that is not necessary. I think that'd be really cool. It's not something that's going to be easy, but that would definitely be a fun subclass to play. So yeah, if you look at kind of, wuxia films and things like that, of other things that you see monks doing, and martial artists in general. I mentioned before, the idea of a martial arts sorcerer kind of thing is really interesting in that they don't cast spells like a sorcerer does. Their martial arts and their control of their body and their ki allows them to literally manipulate matter, and allows them to do really cool, interesting things. If you look at the bad guy in the Forbidden Kingdom, which I mentioned in my last video, he is a really, really good example of kind of that martial arts sorcerer style character, where he is a very skilled martial artist and he fights, but every so often he'll use his chi magic to do something like turn someone to stone or things like that. That is a really interesting idea of kind of melding martial arts and magic in a similar way you might see a blade singer and eldritch knight, but using ki and specifically focusing on the idea of control of combat that you would see in a monk. So things like that I think would be really, really interesting. Yeah. Otherwise, again, the monk has never been quite as expanded upon. Well, let's do it this way. Final thoughts. So the monk itself in D&D has never quite been as expanded upon as other classes. Like fighters, there's about 1 billion different versions of a fighter. They're actually, the Kensei used to be the sword saint, and it used to be a fighter subclass. It eventually turned into a monk subclass. So if we're taking examples from previous versions of D&D, we have almost all of the previous versions of the monk already in 5th edition in various ways. So if you're trying to design a subclass so that a monk can play more similarly to how it did in earlier editions. Oh, and I never mentioned 4th edition. The 4th edition monk was really interesting because all of its powers had a movement ability built into it. So if you used a certain power, you would have a different version of movement that you could do, which is really, really interesting, but remarkably complicated. Transitioning that into 5th edition, I think would fit a little bit more with that stance talk that I talked about before. Maybe not all stances change your attacks. Maybe some of your stances change your movement. Things like that. So anyway, so right now we already have a good representation of the monk across the years in 5th edition. So if you do want to be homebrewing monk stuff, taking inspiration from other systems is probably going to be your best bet if you don't have an idea in your head. Looking at other systems and going, wow, a monk can do that in this system, and I think that's pretty interesting. 13th Age actually has an interesting system for their monks, which is not one of their base classes. It shows up in 13 more ages or something like that. I can't remember the book. But they have a combo system built into it where each attack has a subsequent attack you can do in the next turn. And that's a really interesting thing. I don't think it would work in 5th edition the way it works in 13th Age because it's very, very different. But it's a cool idea. Combo systems would be very interesting. So I think that is going to be the best place for you to find inspiration for new subclasses is look at different systems or look at what inspired it originally. Watch, old kung fu movies or new ones like new stuff that like Hong Kong cinema is still creating some really, really interesting stuff. Japanese cinema, obviously, Japanese anime is going to provide you with a lot of really interesting ideas because that's partially where a lot of this idea comes from is, modern folklore nowadays is cartoons and movies. Like those are our myths. Our modern myths now are things like superheroes and cartoon shows and the comic books and things like that. Those are myths for our culture in the same way that the gods and goddesses of Olympus were the myths of ancient Greek society. So look at our mythology that we've created and look at the different cultures of mythology. Look at martial arts from different countries. Like, again, this is mostly an Asian, mostly Chinese martial arts that are represented in the monk. If you look, even if you go as close by as looking at the Philippines, they have some really, really interesting martial arts there. If you start going into Western martial arts, Russian Salat, I believe it's called, is kind of a brawling, grappling style martial art. Greco-Roman wrestling is a martial art that still exists, and it's not remarkably different from what they were doing in the first Olympics. Like wrestling has not made massive changes as far as as far as like the rules changing massively or anything like that. Obviously, new techniques come out on a regular basis, but we're still looking at a martial art that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. So taking inspiration from actual martial arts. If you go over to Brazil and you get Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a brilliant, extremely effective martial art now, and we don't really have grappling style monks. If you look at the things like capoeira, capoeira is a really unique, fun, interesting martial art that would be very, very different if you translated it into a 5th edition subclass for the monk. Even things like boxing is kind of our Western version of martial arts. And even when you look at the different versions of boxing, you have kickboxing. If you go over to France, you have savate, which is a French version of kickboxing, which is really, really interesting and remarkably useful as an actual combat ability as opposed to just being a combat sport. It was developed for French sailors. And some of the abilities in it are really, really bad. I can't remember what it's called. It's a kick where you aim. It's a piston style kick that you aim for just above the knee to separate the knee. As your target is moving forward towards you, you go and you literally try to separate their knee and basically destroy their leg. And if you hit correctly, you've just won the fight. You've just taken out one of their limbs in one of the most painful ways possible. It is really, really brutal. So yeah, those are the kind of things that I think if you want to homebrew the monk, look at modern martial arts that aren't just your Chinese wushu style martial arts. Expand to other countries, expand to other parts of the world, because martial arts are something that is effectively universal. Every culture has their own martial art in some way, shape, or form. Some of them lean more on the artistic side, like a lot of kung fu and wushu and jiu general is very, very artistic. Whereas other ones are going to be much, much more about the martial side. Most Western martial arts and weapons forms and things like that are much more about use and lethality than it is about looking pretty and having an artistic aspect to it. So really expand your view of what you consider quote unquote martial arts and look into a lot of different things and understand that the monk in and of itself is built around the idea of someone that has dedicated their life to a martial art form. And uses that in unique and interesting ways, which is why it has that control aspect compared to the fighter, which has dedicated his life to martial ability, which is different than martial arts. So anyway, that is going to be all for me today. As always, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and turn notifications on. All those things are super important for this video being seen by other human beings. In the comments down below, is there an inspiration for a subclass that I did not mention? Do you have a really, a really strong want to play a certain kind of monk and that just doesn't exist in 5th edition? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that is all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.